the ACA stuff, we had talked, I think, in the past about the subsidy that was ending. And there were two basic principles, I think, that you outlined that Biden had in approaching this. One was to make the subsidies more generous, and the other was to deal with the cliff. And they locked in the subsidies when they realized, like, oh, these subsidies can end in October. That's bad timing for that. And they were able to push it to the 2025. This notion about the cliff, we have this dynamic in all federal programs. And I mean, the solution to this would, is Medicare for all for me. And I think this, the way that this resolves it, I think also gets us a step closer in some weird way conceptually. But the way that they addressed it was instead of a hard cutoff at 400% of poverty, where the subsidies end in the ACA marketplaces, they said, we're going to give those subsidies up to 400%. But then after that, you cannot spend more than 8.5% of your income on health insurance. And what I find fascinating about this, in addition to it dealing with a cliff, right? Because it basically says, like, we have a second cliff which nobody drops off. Essentially, it's like a cliff and then like a summit, I guess.
Plateau, yeah. A
plateau. It also begins to make it easier to communicate in the future. You're already paying 8.5% of your income in health insurance as a minimum under the ACA. Well, a 6% tax is 2.5% or 2.25% less. And if we just go to a 6% tax on everybody, we've got Medicare for all or something to that effect.
The problem is not everybody is on the ACA insurance exchanges, of course, but I think you are hitting on something, which is a sort of change in policy. And actually, you see it most acutely in the process of Build Back Better with the child care subsidies, because the child care bill was initially written to look a lot like the ACA, right? It had this subsidy cliff. It said, we will subsidize lower income individuals up to a certain point. And then if you're over that in earnings, you're on your own. And, that got very negative headlines. They put this thing in the child care bill that created another cliff, even though they were fixing the ACA cliff in the same bill. There was another cliff, at least for the first 3 years on the child care. And it was going to be at a time when they were increasing pay in the childcare workforce, and the people who were using childcare who were above that cliff were going to see thousands of dollars of increases for childcare. And so that became, really negative. And then they raised the cliff to a level that few people would get to it. But then that bill, of course, got thrown out. Right. At the same time in that childcare bill, the principle after 3 years was that nobody pays more than 7% of their income in childcare. So you're seeing this shift from just subsidizing the poor to creating universal systems where a threshold level is set above which nobody would have to pay. That is a change in sort of policy design. And I think the fact that it's being changed in the ACA, even though it's a short-term fix, this is one that I think, particularly because it's cheap enough, it's one that's going to be extended and extended and extended and become etched in stone as the policy.
And I don't know, I guess from my perspective, when I see that there is, and I understand it's to a limited group of people in the country this applies to, but when I see the idea of a principle of this percentage of your income is not to be exceeded. I mean, on some level, it's a price control, but it's sort of like, it's I guess.
No, it's a price control. Sure.
And it's graded on your income. But that concept is also like very easy to transfer and communicate as a tax, right? Like, once we get that principle that childcare should not cost more than 7%, healthcare should not cost more than 8% of your income, then it's easier to go to an argument of like, this is a simple calculation, and this is what Bernie Sanders was trying to make this argument all through the 2016 and into the 2020 election, was like, it's going to be cheaper for you and society because you're paying this amount, but now we have institutionalized sort of a certain number on some level so that we know the number that we have to beat from a taxation standpoint.
I do think we should also stress that this got passed kind of by accident, because they set the level for the cliff to return at the end of this year, and notices would have gone out literally in the next few days, a month before the election, that said your health insurance is going up X $1,000 a month. So it was Democrats creating their own October surprise. And so they needed to diffuse that, and that's why it ended up getting into this bill.
You also have a good story in there about the process of of drug negotiations. That I want to head over to the tax stuff, but you do point out that Pelosi has in the past quashed a lot of these reforms.
Well, I mean, drug price reform is something that, going back to the Clinton era was something that Democrats wanted as a core win. In 2006, there was the 6 for 06. These were the 6 bills that we were definitely going to pass in the first 100 hours. And one of them was prescription drug price reform to allow negotiation with Medicare. And that passed, and it didn't pass the Senate. And for years and years and years, you would see campaign ads from frontline and candidates saying, I'm going to reform prescription drugs. I'm going to pass prescription drug reform. And it just never happened and never happened and never happened. The seeds for what ends up in the Inflation Reduction Act come from after Pelosi and the Democrats regained the House in 2018. And they progressives have been putting together a bill. The whole thing about negotiating prescription drug prices with Medicare is you have to figure out the mechanism that will force the drug companies to actually engage in the negotiation. Because if it's voluntary, they're like, well, no, I'm not going to negotiate with you. Take my drug or leave it. But if you have to impose some sort of price on them. And what progressives wanted to do was called compulsory licensing. Oh, you don't want to negotiate with us? We're going to take your patent back that we gave to you. What Pelosi came up with was this bizarre arbitration scheme where the Government Accountability Office, which has never done arbitration and has no experience, particularly in the prescription drug industry, would have been the arbitrator there would essentially be 2 bids that would be put in, the drug company saying this is what I want to pay, and the Medicare saying this is what we want to pay, and then the arbitrator would figure it out. This was bizarre. It seemed
this was really, during the Trump administration too, incidentally, right?
An attempt to yes, and Trump had been talking about passing prescription drug reform, and they were trying to find a way that would be favorable to him. So progressives completely balked at this and said this is stupid, and they ended up with something that they found from the Center American Progress, Topher Spiro, who was working there, which was this high excise tax. So if you don't participate in the program, we'll throw 100% tax on you. So that seems to be able to be worthwhile to get drug companies to the table. So that structure stayed in place. Now, there were other things that were weakened because you had a lot of pro-pharma reps that ended up hacking away at the bill. I don't like the fact that it's only 10 drugs in the first year. I don't like the fact that it doesn't start till 2026. Yep. I don't like the fact that the benchmark price is from 2021 prices, which are already high. There are a lot of things not to like in this very modest drug price reform. But once you get it in place, you can build on it. We see that in the same bill with the ACA, right? They got it in place. It had this subsidy cliff. Then they fixed that so that it's affordable insurance for everybody. you can see a similar dynamic happening in future years with the drug price reform. It's in place now. Medicare is allowed to negotiate at some level on prescription drug prices, and you could see that added to in future years.
You don't have to build the machine. You just have to dial it up a little
That's
bit
right.
each time, and it becomes a little bit. All right, so let's move to the tax stuff. This again walks through like it shows you lay out the value of running for president when you're a senator. Elizabeth Warren was able to basically mainstream. She was talking about a wealth tax. She was talking about big taxes that became mainstream ideas, and that has an impact on her fellow senators, I guess, and the House, and just sort of like Washington in general, where an idea gets out there and becomes, more mainstream.
And really, it affected Biden, right? I mean, it affected the entire presidential race. This talking point about Amazon not paying taxes started with Warren, but then moved over to everybody in the entire Democratic. Even Andrew Yang was using that talking point at one point, and Biden as well. He assessed it and really liked it. And what Warren came up with as sort of the solution to that was this corporate minimum tax, this book profits tax is what it's called. And it says that instead of we're going to apply a minimum tax based on the statement that you make to the IRS, for large corporations above a certain threshold of earnings, we're going to tax the profits that you report to your investors. And the profits you report to your investors are going to be pretty good because you want your investors to see that you're making a lot of money. And so this flips the dynamic because, the accountants and lawyers get in there with the IRS statement and try to minimize the amount of earnings. But it's the opposite dynamic when you're talking about financial statements to investors. You're maximizing the total earnings. And so that's the core idea. And it gets all this buy-in during the campaign, including with the other presidential candidates. Biden ends up putting it in his budget, even though it was a minimized form. That was a big moment. And essentially, the way that the tax measures of the Inflation Reduction Act got done is that there was a huge menu of here are a bunch of tax ideas. Here, we know we have to hit X amount of dollars in the end to please Manchin and do deficit reduction. So we'll just pick off that menu to get to that dollar figure. And, Sinema comes in, Kyrsten Sinema, and says, I don't want to raise tax rates on anything, individuals, businesses. I don't want to raise tax rates. And the menu is like shot through holes at that point.
Right.
Like there's very little left on the menu that's important. But, the Warren tax does not raise individual or corporate tax rates. And so Warren goes to Sinema and Manchin.
It just creates basically, instead of like changing the ceiling, it's a
floor. Yeah, it's a minimum. It's like
so,
it's like the alternative minimum tax, which was actually put in under Reagan for corporations and removed by Trump. So she goes to Sinema and Manchin and she says, look, there aren't a lot of options left, but my option's a big one sitting there on the menu. And within days of Sinema saying, no more tax rate increases, she endorses the Warren plan, and so does Manchin. And so that created this huge momentum where you knew if anything was going to pass in the end, it was going to have that corporate minimum tax. Now, Sinema at the end puts in a carve out for private equity companies. I think when I was talking to Warren's camp, people in Warren's camp, it was more like, if we were able to pass that right away when Sinema endorsed it, it would have been intact. Right. But waiting a year, because, she endorsed in October of 2021, waiting a year ended up, everybody got to regroup and the lobbyists could focus on one item, and it was, private equity in that case.
That dynamic is also why I thought that they should have followed the American Rescue Plan with the Build Back Better within months, because the longer you let this stuff hang out there, essentially, like flies, the more lobbyists you'll get who come in and say like, oh, I got to get rid of this. I mean, that takes a process, right? Like banks got to hire a lobbyist and say like, hey, do I have a problem with this bill? And they go and they do research and they find out they do. Okay, here's some more money. Make sure that problem goes away. I got to talk to this guy. I got to talk to that guy and work their way through it and make arguments and this and that. The shorter window you have, the better. All right. Lastly, and then it's just what do they do on the IRS front? And can you tell me that they're not going to go after they're going to go after rich people instead of low income people? This has been some ridiculous talking point. We know. I mean, I should say, I put up graphs during the show in the past of, particularly in 2010 when we had the biggest cuts to the IRS, at least over in modern times, you can see they audited low income people a little bit less, but they audited high income people, rich people, way less.
And that's entirely a function of resources. So when you're auditing lower income people, you're just looking at the earned income tax credit, basically, and seeing whether or not they earned more or got more back under the ITC than they were supposed to. For higher income people, that you need a team to figure that stuff out. And the teams weren't there. The IRS had been gutted since Reagan. So this creates the funding to get that back. And not only will it be used to audit more higher income people, but it will be used to improve the services of the IRS, which we all should be in favor of. If you ever had the problem of having to deal with the IRS, you know that nobody answers the phone, that their website is a little bit antiquated, that it's just hard to find a human being. It's hard to get an answer. I had a situation with a refund in 2021 where it took months, the check didn't show up and they had to do an investigation. And, it was 4 or 5 months before I got this refund check. I think it's in everyone's interest. Not only will it try to shrink that tax gap, which is something like $1 trillion a year between what people in corporations actually owe and what is actually collected. So it's trying to shrink that gap, but it's also going to be beneficial for just customer service at the IRS.
All right. So lastly, and I know you got to get going, but folks should read this piece and really just an incredible service to understand the dynamics that take place with this stuff, because as loathsome as it is, it's real. It exists. It's not going to be wished away. Certainly, I think when we talk about the outside climate activists raging and, without policy, very helpful because it creates a certain strength behind it. But Absolutely. The policy ends up being, it's almost like the rage is the gunpowder and the policy is, the lead that actually is the projectile. I don't know.
Very elegant.
Thank you. But so how
you are a screenwriter, aren't you?
With this understanding, I've read your piece. What do I, as an activist, as a citizen, what do I take from it? What should I do? Is there anything I do differently, or is this really,
well, I mean, I think there are a couple things that you can say. I mean, I think it's important to know the process in order to understand how certain goals that you might have could finally be reached. It's important to know that policy familiarity is a real important thing here. It's important to know that the filibuster is really, it's not just that you can't get bills through, it's that the bills that you can get through have to be twisted and distorted in so many ways that they become unintelligible, and that creates these omnibus bills because, there's only one bill leaving this year. I'm going to put everything into it, and it makes it impossible to message politically. So eliminating the filibuster is a really good start here to create some more coherence in policymaking. But I don't think that's enough necessarily. I mean, I think that you're still going to have this dynamic around path dependence and policy familiarity. And I just think it's important to sort of understand, get your arms around that. These omnibus bills do not work well for activists, for outside groups. They're impossible to explain to people. They're hard to rally around. If you have 18 different things in a bill, you don't know which one to elevate or which one to talk about. I think that there was a lot of money spent by outside groups to try to pass Build Back Better. Like $150 million was spent in swing states that no one knows about. Because it was these ads trying to pass policy that are inevitably just impossible to do. Like they don't work, and that money could have gone towards organizing, to creating the gunpowder, to organizing, to building bottom up momentum for some of these kinds of things. And
to developing ideas that may get passed 5 years from now or 3 years from now.
Introducing legislation. I mean, sometimes I shy away. People will say, hey, can I write this? Like my staff might say, can I write this story about a bill that was introduced? I'm like, that bill's not going to pass, is it? Like, why would we do a story about that? But, I'm kind of turning around on that, because the introduction of bills, their bills are like waves almost. One of them almost gets to the shore, and then that builds momentum for the next one to get a little closer and a little closer, and suddenly it's high tide and you can pass the bill. This process it takes years. It takes a long time to get buy-in to the point that you can actually pass them. Very few things in Washington are overnight successes.
Right.
And I think that's important to know. So so you know where to focus your energies.
I had that dynamic back in the Air America days. We would cover, like, there's some state senator who's introducing some crazy bill in Idaho. Why are you doing that? Why are you talking about that? Well, now that guy is, he's just passed it in the U.S. Senate. I mean, it's that type of type of situation. And also, I think, too, you can see like Warren's introduction of stuff during the campaign that ended up being into this tax bill. I feel like you could do a story about, like, Sanders' labor stuff rippling through the administration, even though he lost. I mean, and
Warren in competition policy. Yep. There are plenty of ways in which, I mean, that's a whole dynamic in and of itself. Like, Biden had no policy apparatus when he became the nominee, and there was this huge volunteer effort to sort of create a platform for him. And there was this Biden-Sanders Unity Task Force, which you might remember, that created like 110 pages of recommendations. And so, unlike other post nominee campaigns where the progressive side and the establishment side would continue to be at odds, like in 2016, the Unity Task Force was it was a unifying moment. It was a moment where everybody was sort of going forward with one voice, and that has reflected itself in a lot of Biden, not all of them, but in a lot of Biden policies since he's been in office.
David Dayen, really impressive piece of work. Folks can find not just that piece, but a lot more impressive pieces of work over at theprospect.org. We will put a link to it. Can't encourage people enough. Become a member, support The Prospect. It's one of those places where you can send, anybody the piece that you've read because of that lack of a paywall, and so very good thing to support. David Dayen, always a pleasure.